I've had a few follow-up thoughts about the situation in Venezuela and how there's this hardcore Soviet-style socialism very close to attempts to establish communism. I guess you have that in Venezuela, at least for the name, right? It's hard to say because it's backed by the CCP and China, who, when you look more closely, abandoned some of the old communist principles. So I guess it's just like kind of almost a tapas for people to gain power using ideologies that people care about, right? So you have this hardcore version of Venezuela, and thought for one thing to give different socialist movements the benefit of the doubt, right? You can say, well, there's on one side this extreme version of communism versus something like what you have in Scandinavia. High income taxes, to a certain extent private property, and there's no attempt to get rid of that. Its aim is to have social security nets, and of course there's limits to property, to your house, what you can do with it, it can be expropriated and so on. And that might be further going than in the US. Open question whether that is just a pre-step and whether there's an aim to actually go more towards a socialist communist world and political players can achieve that for the moment. But even if that's not the intention, you could think it spirals down into more communist form, which is maybe already motivated by the regulatory downward spiral. I think Mises and Hayek also talk about where regulating one thing makes it necessary to regulate more things. So even if it's not intended, it may kind of go down there, and politicians who like to extend power use the current power, even if it's just some bad actors do. Why not, right? There's a motivation and incentives to do that. So there's a question if that's maybe an opening of a Pandora's box. But for sure there's kind of somewhat different version, at least on the surface level, between the Scandinavian forms and the Venezuelan one. The Venezuelan dictators are to a much more obvious extent malicious bad actors, right? Self-enrichment, kind of want to enrich their cousins. And you could say, well, in Europe, politicians are after power too, right? They also want to give money to their cousins, and they just play a better Machiavellian game by hiding it or being nice. But benefit of the doubt would be, well, there's maybe also people who at least have good intentions. And at least that's what usually people think, right? And that seems to be very different in Venezuela. Or if you probably look at the CCP, right? Venezuela being also used by Fidel Castro and his ambitions. And socialism always kind of degenerate, maybe not the nice word for those people who care about communism, but that kind of always transforms automatically into communism. But there's those obvious difference. Is there a categorical difference, or is that just kind of pretty much degrees and one transforming into the other? Could also be because of intentions, politicians or groups wanting to push it there. It's just an in-between goal, or kind of decays or moves there by dynamics like the regulatory spiral. Do you think there's a kind of outcome difference between more or less well-meaning or intending politicians on one side who want to build a safety net, and evil dictators on the other side that want to enrich themselves? Presumably the world is not as black and white, but is there kind of a relevant difference? That's some thoughts I had when being confronted with the current Venezuela situation. Reading up on the backgrounds with Fidel Castro and how Venezuela pretty much went really downhill with some developments of Fidel Castro pretty much teaming up with this, I forgot the name, in the end of 80s or 90s, kind of this military guy who tried to coup in Venezuela, failed, and then somehow got rehabilitated and got backing from the Soviet Union via Fidel Castro. Or I guess back then Fidel Castro also lost the backing of the Soviet Union and needed new places he can parasitically exploit. So that's my short note.